Commander Zethkar stood before the massive viewing screen in the High Council chamber. The blue marble of Earth rotated slowly in the center display, while data streams flowed around it like digital waterfalls. His forearms remained clasped, behind his back as the council leader spoke in the ancient tongue of his people. "This species calls themselves humans," the elderly Valorian said, his voice echoing through the crystal chamber. "They have been in space for less than 200 of their years, yet they spread faster than any race we have documented. The Catherian collective has decided to test their strength." Zethkar nodded once. He had served the hegemony for 3 centuries and witnessed the rise and fall of dozens of civilizations. Most new species followed predictable patterns when faced with superior force. They either surrendered quickly or fought brief defensive wars before accepting their place in the galactic order. The Catherians were efficient teachers of such lessons. "Your mission is simple," the council leader continued. "Observe their military response. Document their capabilities. The High Command needs to understand what kind of threat or ally these humans might become." The assignment seemed routine enough. Zethkar had performed similar observations 47 times before. Young civilizations rarely surprised him anymore. They had their moments of defiance, but reality always won in the end. The galaxy was vast and old, and it had rules that could not be broken by courage alone. His ship launched 3 days later. The Silent Watcher was perfectly designed for its purpose. Advanced stealth systems made it invisible to most sensors, while powerful observation equipment could record everything from space battles to individual conversations on planetary surfaces. Zethkar had requested a minimal crew of 6 specialists, who shared his preference for quiet efficiency. The journey to human space took 2 weeks through hyperspace lanes. During the trip, Zethkar studied the intelligence reports about this new species. Humans had evolved on a world they called Earth in a system they named Sol. Their planet was mostly water with large land masses where billions of them lived in complex societies. They had discovered faster-than-light travel only recently, but had already established colonies on dozens of worlds. What interested Zethkar most were the reports about human behavior. Unlike most species that developed unified governments before reaching space, humans remained divided into hundreds of separate nations. Even as they explored the stars, they seemed to disagree about everything, yet somehow worked together when facing external threats. This contradiction puzzled him. The Catherian invasion force had massed at the edge of what humans called the Centauri system. 3 colonies existed, there with a combined population of nearly 50 million humans. The Catherians had brought enough ships to conquer 3 times that number. Their commander was War Prime Haxthor, a veteran of 30 successful campaigns who had never retreated from any battlefield. Zethkar positioned his ship at maximum observation range and activated all recording systems. The human defensive fleet was already moving into position around the largest colony world. He counted 47 human vessels of various sizes, facing a Catherian force of 138 ships. The mathematics were clear and simple. Through his sensors, Zethkar watched the human fleet organize itself. Their flagship was something they called the UES Liberty, a massive battleship that served as command center for their defense. Smaller vessels took positions in what appeared to be a standard defensive formation. Everything looked normal and predictable. Then something changed. Instead of waiting for the Catherians to attack, the human fleet began moving forward. Zethkar checked his instruments twice to make sure he was reading correctly. The humans were advancing directly toward the superior enemy force. This made no tactical sense whatsoever. He activated his communication intercepts and began listening to human transmissions. The voice of their fleet commander came through clearly. Captain Jake Morrison was his name according to the intelligence files. A career military officer with 23 years of service and a reputation for aggressive tactics. "All ships, this is Liberty Command." Morrison's voice crackled through space. "We know the odds and we know what's at stake. Every minute we keep them busy here gives our people on the colonies more time to evacuate civilians to the inner worlds. We're not here to win pretty. We're here to buy time with blood." The transmission continued with detailed tactical orders, but Zethkar found himself focusing on Morrison's tone rather than his words. There was no fear in the human's voice. No resignation or despair despite facing impossible odds. Instead, there was something that Zethkar had rarely heard in similar situations. Determination mixed with what humans might call grim satisfaction. The Catherian fleet responded to the human advance by accelerating their own attack schedule. War Prime Haxthor was known for his patience, but the unexpected aggression seemed to irritate him. His ships moved into attack formation with the precision that had made them masters of 47 star systems. Zethkar prepared his recording equipment for what he expected would be a brief and decisive battle. The Catherians would demonstrate their superiority, and the humans would either surrender or be destroyed. He had witnessed this pattern so many times that he could predict almost exactly how events would unfold. The first energy weapons began firing as the two fleets closed to combat range. Brilliant beams of coherent light and streams of charged particles lit up the darkness between stars. The Catherian ships fired with mechanical precision, while human vessels seemed to dance through space in patterns that looked almost random. But as Zethkar watched more carefully, he began to notice something strange about the human tactics. Their seemingly chaotic movements were actually calculated risks designed to minimize damage, while maximizing their own offensive opportunities. They were fighting like they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. This was not how defeated armies behaved. Zethkar had seen enough battles to recognize the signs of impending collapse. Crews became desperate, commands became confused, formations broke apart as individual ships tried to save themselves. None of these indicators appeared in the human fleet. Instead, they seemed to be getting more dangerous as the battle continued. The battle had been raging for 6 hours when Zethkar witnessed something that changed his understanding of warfare forever. A human destroyer commanded by Lieutenant Commander Amy Patterson had taken severe damage to its main engines and weapon systems. Standard military doctrine for any civilized species would require the crew to withdraw from combat or surrender to preserve their lives. Amy Patterson chose a third option that existed nowhere in Valorian military manuals. Her ship accelerated, directly toward the largest Catherian vessel in the enemy formation. Zethkar watched through his sensors as the human destroyer's hull began glowing red from energy weapon impacts. Internal explosions lit up the ship's superstructure like fireworks. Any reasonable commander would have ordered evacuation at that point. Instead, Patterson's voice came across the communication channels one final time. "Liberty Command, this is Defiant. We're going out, but we're taking some of them with us. Tell my kids their mom loved them more than anything in the universe." The destroyer struck the Catherian dreadnought at nearly full speed. The explosion was visible to the naked eye from Zethkar's position millions of kilometers away. When the energy dispersed, both ships were gone along with 2 Catherian cruisers that had been positioned too close to their flagship. Zethkar had to replay the sensor recordings 3 times before he could accept what he had witnessed. A single human ship had eliminated 4 enemy vessels through what could only be described as suicide tactics. But the term suicide implied desperation or madness. Patterson's final transmission suggested something else entirely. She had made a calculated trade that she considered worthwhile. The battle continued with increasing intensity. Human ships that should have retreated instead pressed their attacks harder. Crews that should have surrendered kept fighting until their vessels were completely destroyed. Zethkar began to understand that he was not observing normal military behavior. He was witnessing something fundamentally different about how humans approached warfare. On the surface of Colony 7, the situation was even more disturbing from Zethkar's perspective. Catherian ground forces had successfully landed and established beachheads near the 3 largest population centers. Their warriors were bred for combat from birth and equipped with weapons that could penetrate most known armor. They had conquered 47 worlds using exactly these tactics. Major Ben Carter commanded the human ground defense with what appeared to be a mixture of regular military units and armed civilians. Zethkar watched through orbital sensors as the human defensive positions were systematically overrun by superior Catherian forces. This was the moment when any reasonable species would begin negotiating surrender terms. Instead, something impossible happened. The humans fell back to the next defensive line and kept fighting. When that position became untenable, they retreated to prepared positions within the cities themselves. When the Catherians breached those defenses, the humans continued fighting from individual buildings. Sergeant Lisa Brooks was coordinating the defense of a civilian evacuation center when Catherian warriors finally broke through the outer barriers. She had been wounded twice and her ammunition was running low. Standard procedure would require her to surrender in order to protect the civilians under her command. Brooks ordered the civilians to the lower levels and continued fighting. When her rifle ammunition ran out, she picked up a fallen Catherian weapon. When that weapon failed, she began using improvised explosives. When those were exhausted, she fought with salvaged metal pipes and chunks of concrete. The Catherian warriors had never encountered anything like this. Their entire military doctrine was based on the assumption that inferior forces would recognize their disadvantage and submit to superior strength. They had no protocols for dealing with enemies who refused to acknowledge that they were beaten. Zethkar monitored communications between Catherian ground commanders and began to detect something he had never heard before in their voices. Confusion. The warrior caste that had conquered nearly 50 worlds was struggling to understand an enemy that would not behave according to the established rules of warfare. The humans seemed to fight hardest when they were losing. Individual soldiers cut off from their units continued attacking instead of seeking rescue. Civilian populations provided support to military forces instead of demanding protection from them. Even human children were contributing to the war effort by carrying supplies and maintaining equipment. This violated everything Zethkar understood about how civilized societies functioned. In proper military engagements, there were clear distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. Professional soldiers fought while civilians remained safely removed from danger. Battles had definite conclusions when one side demonstrated clear superiority over the other. Human warfare seemed to operate by completely different principles. The line between soldiers and civilians blurred until it disappeared entirely. Battles continued long past the point where victory or defeat should have been obvious to all participants. Individual humans seemed willing to trade their lives for minimal tactical advantages. The space battle was reaching its climax when Captain Morrison made a decision that crystallized everything Zethkar had been observing. The UES Liberty had taken critical damage and was losing power to essential systems. The remaining human fleet was outnumbered 3-1. Any competent commander would order a withdrawal to preserve what forces remained. Morrison did exactly the opposite. He ordered all remaining ships to form up for a final assault on the Catherian command vessel. The human fleet charged directly into the heart of the enemy formation with their weapons blazing, and their engines pushed beyond safe operational limits. "All ships follow me in," Morrison's voice carried across the communication channels. "We came here to buy time and we're going to pay whatever it costs. These bugs think they can scare us into running. Time to show them what humans do when someone threatens our families." The final assault was magnificent and terrible. Human ships exploded one after another as they pressed deeper into the Catherian formation. But each explosion took enemy vessels with it. Each human death inflicted multiple casualties on their opponents. The mathematics of the battle began, shifting in ways that defied conventional military analysis. When the last human ship finally died, War Prime Haxthor found himself in command of less than 60% of his original force. The colony world lay before him barely defended. Victory was his according to every rule of warfare that existed. But something had changed in the Catherian commander's mind. His warriors were reporting that human ground forces were still fighting, despite being completely surrounded. Civilian populations were refusing to surrender even when offered terms. The entire human species seemed to be infected with some kind of madness that made them immune to intimidation. For the first time in his long military career, War Prime Haxthor found himself questioning whether victory was worth the cost of achieving it. The humans had lost this battle, but they had shown that conquering them would require resources and sacrifices that might exceed what the collective was willing to pay. Zethkar recorded everything and began to realize that his initial assessment had been completely wrong. He had come here expecting to document another routine conquest. Instead, he was witnessing the birth of something that might reshape the entire galactic balance of power. 3 weeks after the Battle of Colony 7, something unprecedented happened in galactic military history. The Catherian collective began retreating from human space. War Prime Hax Thor had managed to capture the outer colonies, but his advance had stalled completely when human reinforcements arrived under the command of Admiral Grace Thompson. Zethkar repositioned his observation ship to monitor the new developments. Thompson's fleet was smaller than Morrison's had been, but the humans were employing tactics that made no sense according to standard military doctrine. Instead of massing their forces for decisive battles, they broke into small groups that struck at Catherian supply lines and communication networks. The humans called it guerrilla warfare, and the concept translated poorly into any civilized language. Proper military engagements involved organized formations fighting for control of strategic objectives. These human tactics resembled the behavior of space pirates more than a legitimate military force, but the results were undeniable. Catherian supply convoys began disappearing. Communication relays went offline without warning. Forward bases reported constant harassment by small human units that appeared without detection and vanished before reinforcements could respond. The collective found itself fighting an enemy that refused to present proper targets for their superior firepower. Admiral Thompson seemed to understand that humans could not win through conventional methods, so she had simply abandoned conventional methods entirely. Her forces operated according to principles that valued mobility and surprise over raw strength. They attacked when they possessed advantages and disappeared when they faced superior opposition. Zethkar began monitoring Catherian military communications and detected growing frustration among their commanders. Warriors bred for decisive combat found themselves chasing shadows through asteroid fields and nebulae. Supply officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining logistics networks under constant attack. Morale among the invasion force was deteriorating for reasons that made no tactical sense. The situation on Centauri Prime illustrated the broader problem facing the collective. The industrial moon had been captured during the initial assault, but human resistance had never completely ended. Chief Engineer Paul Martinez had escaped the initial occupation and established a network of hidden manufacturing facilities throughout the moon's underground tunnel systems. Instead of trying to recapture the surface installations, Martinez had converted civilian factories into weapons production centers. Mining equipment became improvised artillery. Chemical refineries began producing military explosives. Even food processing plants were modified to manufacture ammunition and spare parts for human weapons. When Catherian forces tried to destroy these hidden facilities, they discovered that the entire civilian population had been armed and trained for combat. Shopkeepers fought alongside professional soldiers. Factory workers operated heavy weapons with deadly efficiency. Children as young as 12 served as scouts and message runners for resistance cells. The Catherians had conquered 47 worlds, but they had never encountered anything like this. Their military doctrine assumed that civilian populations would cooperate with occupying forces in exchange for protection and basic necessities. Human civilians seemed more interested in killing their occupiers than in preserving their own safety. Zethkar watched through surveillance drones as a Catherian patrol entered what appeared to be an abandoned shopping district. The buildings looked empty and harmless. Then windows began exploding outward as human fighters opened fire from concealed positions. The patrol was eliminated in less than 3 minutes by opponents they never saw clearly. This pattern repeated itself across every occupied territory. The Catherians could win battles, but they could not end the fighting. Every victory came at a cost that exceeded its strategic value. Every occupied area required constant reinforcement to prevent human counterattacks. The invasion that should have been completed in months showed no signs of reaching a conclusion. The turning point came when Corporal Danny Kim's reconnaissance unit was surrounded by an entire Catherian company near the ruins of New Detroit. Standard procedure would require the humans to surrender or attempt to escape through stealth. Kim chose an option that violated every rule of civilized warfare. Zethkar watched through orbital sensors as Kim activated a thermal detonator in the middle of the enemy formation. The explosion killed all 6 members of the human unit along with 23 Catherian warriors. Kim's final transmission was brief and matter-of-fact. "Tell my wife I kept my promise. Tell my kids their daddy fought for them until the end." The incident itself was tactically insignificant. 6 humans trading their lives for 23 enemies represented a favorable exchange ratio, but hardly decisive in a war involving millions of combatants. What mattered was the psychological impact on Catherian forces who witnessed it. Warriors who had never retreated from any battlefield began reporting equipment failures and medical issues that prevented them from participating in combat operations. Unit commanders started requesting additional reinforcements for routine patrol missions. The collective's military leadership found itself dealing with problems they had no experience solving. The final assault on the main Catherian base demonstrated everything that made human warfare so terrifying to observe. Admiral Thompson coordinated a simultaneous attack by conventional fleet units and guerrilla forces that had been operating behind enemy lines for weeks. The space battle followed familiar patterns, with human ships trading themselves for enemy vessels at ratios that favored neither side. But while the Catherians focused on the fleet engagement, human ground forces emerged from hiding places throughout the occupied territories and began attacking every military installation simultaneously. Supply depots exploded. Communication centers went offline. Landing fields became killing zones as hidden human units opened fire on Catherian reinforcements. The entire occupied zone descended into chaos as months of careful preparation by resistance cells reached fruition in a single coordinated strike. War Prime Haxthor found himself commanding scattered units with no reliable communications and dwindling supplies, while facing enemies who seemed to emerge from solid rock. His warriors reported that human fighters appeared to possess detailed knowledge of every Catherian position and capability. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. Human civilians had been observing and reporting on occupying forces since the day they arrived. Children playing in the streets had been mapping patrol routes. Shopkeepers had been noting equipment types and maintenance schedules. Factory workers had been identifying supply chain vulnerabilities. An entire population had been transformed into an intelligence network that fed information to resistance leaders who used it to plan increasingly effective attacks. The Catherians were not fighting an army. They were fighting an entire civilization that had adapted itself for warfare. When the final Catherian ships lifted off from Centauri Prime, they left behind a scene that would be studied by military historians for centuries. A technologically inferior species had defeated one of the galaxy's most successful military organizations through methods that violated every accepted principle of civilized combat. The humans had won by refusing to fight fairly. They had achieved victory by treating warfare as a problem to be solved, rather than a contest to be won according to established rules. Most disturbing of all, they had demonstrated that civilian populations could be transformed into military assets through organization and determination alone. Zethkar recorded everything and began to understand why his assignment had been classified at the highest security levels. The Valorian High Council had not sent him to observe a routine military engagement. They had sent him to document the emergence of a new kind of warfare that threatened to make traditional military thinking obsolete. Victory celebrations among human forces were unlike anything Zethkar had witnessed in 3 centuries of observing military conflicts. Most species marked successful campaigns with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized glory and conquest. Human celebrations focused on remembering their dead and preparing for future battles. The casualty reports made sobering reading, even by the standards of modern warfare. 38% of the human fleet had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Ground forces had suffered 42% casualties, with entire units completely eliminated during the fighting. Civilian populations in occupied territories had lost nearly 15% of their total numbers. Any other species would have considered such losses catastrophic even in victory. The economic disruption alone would require decades to repair. The social trauma of losing so many productive citizens should have created demands for immediate peace negotiations. Human society should have been on the verge of collapse. Instead, Zethkar observed the opposite reaction. Human military production increased rather than decreased after the battle. Civilian populations volunteered for military service in numbers that exceeded available positions. Political leaders spoke of expanding defensive preparations rather than seeking diplomatic solutions with potential enemies. Colonel Mary Phillips exemplified the human response to warfare's cost. She had lost her left arm defending Orbital Station Delta 7 and spent 3 weeks in medical treatment while doctors attempted to save her damaged leg. Most officers would have accepted medical retirement after such severe injuries. Phillips returned to duty the day she was released from the hospital. Her first action was to request assignment to defensive planning for the next likely battle zone. When asked about her injuries, she dismissed them as minor inconveniences that would not affect her ability to serve. Her personnel file noted that she had specifically refused treatment options that would have fully restored her limbs because they required extended recovery time. This attitude appeared throughout human society at every level. Captain Nick Rodriguez commanded a heavy cruiser that had been crippled during the final assault on Catherian positions. His ship was technically repairable, but would require months in space dock and massive resource investment to return to combat status. Rodriguez submitted a detailed proposal for converting his damaged vessel into what he called a suicide bomber. His plan involved removing all non-essential systems and packing the ship with the largest possible explosive payload. The modified vessel would be used for ramming attacks against enemy capital ships in future engagements. Military engineers accepted the proposal and began implementing Rodriguez's modifications on other damaged vessels. Within weeks, the human fleet included an entire squadron of ships designed for single-use attacks that would destroy their own crews along with their targets. The squadron was oversubscribed with volunteer crews who competed for the honor of commanding these weapons. Zethkar found himself struggling to understand the psychological mechanisms that produced such behavior. His own species valued individual survival and pursued military service as a path to advancement and prestige. The concept of deliberately seeking death in combat was so alien that he required assistance from his ship's computer systems to analyze the cultural patterns involved. The memorial service for human war dead provided disturbing insights into how their society processed traumatic losses. Families gathered to honor fallen soldiers, but the ceremonies emphasized sacrifice rather than mourning. Parents spoke proudly of children who had died in combat. Spouses praised their deceased partners for choosing duty over safety. Most unsettling were the children who attended these services. Youngsters barely old enough to understand the concept of death listened to stories about parents and siblings who had given their lives for humanity's defense. Instead of traumatizing these children, the ceremonies seemed to inspire them with determination to follow similar paths when they reached military age. Admiral Thompson's address to the gathered mourners crystallized everything that made human society so frightening to observe. She stood before thousands of families who had lost members in the recent fighting and spoke words that should have caused riots or demands for her resignation. "We didn't choose this war, but we will finish it," Thompson said with absolute conviction. "Not because we love fighting, but because we love what we're fighting for. We'll teach the galaxy that humans protect their own regardless of the cost. Our enemies can kill us, but they cannot break us. Every death makes us stronger because it proves we're willing to pay any price for freedom." The crowd responded with enthusiastic approval rather than anger or despair. Parents whose children had died cheered statements about future sacrifices. Veterans missing limbs applauded promises of continued warfare. The entire gathering seemed energized by the prospect of additional conflict rather than exhausted by recent losses. Zethkar began monitoring human media broadcasts to understand how their society justified such extreme positions. Military analysts discussed tactical improvements based on lessons learned from recent battles. Political commentators debated resource allocation for expanded defensive preparations. Entertainment programs featured stories about heroic soldiers who had sacrificed themselves for their comrades. Nowhere in these communications did he detect calls for peace or suggestions that warfare might be avoided through diplomatic compromise. Human society seemed to have collectively decided that armed conflict was not only acceptable, but necessary for their continued existence. They were transforming themselves into a civilization optimized for perpetual warfare. The most disturbing evidence came from human educational systems. Schools had modified their curricula to include military training alongside traditional academic subjects. Children learned mathematics through artillery calculations and studied chemistry by manufacturing explosives. Physical education programs emphasized combat skills and small unit tactics. Universities were conducting research projects designed to improve human military capabilities. Engineering students designed more efficient weapon systems. Medical schools focused on trauma treatment and battlefield surgery. Even liberal arts programs analyzed enemy psychology and propaganda techniques that might be useful in future conflicts. Dr. Susan Roberts led a team of researchers studying Catherian biology and behavior patterns. Their goal was developing weapons, specifically designed to exploit the physical and psychological weaknesses of potential enemies. Roberts spoke casually about creating bioweapons that would target Catherian nervous systems while leaving other species unaffected. The project had full government funding and support from civilian institutions throughout human space. No ethical review boards questioned the morality of developing weapons of mass destruction. Public opinion polls showed overwhelming support for any research that might provide military advantages against alien threats. Zethkar realized that he was observing the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. Previous military powers had maintained professional armies that fought wars, while civilian populations remained focused on peaceful pursuits. Human society was evolving into something different, where the entire species served military purposes. Every human citizen was becoming a potential soldier. Every institution was being modified to support warfare. Every aspect of their civilization was being optimized for the production and application of military force. They were not just preparing for the next war. They were becoming a species designed for perpetual conflict. The implications terrified him more than any weapon or military formation he had ever observed. Individual soldiers could be defeated through superior numbers or technology. Professional armies could be destroyed through strategic planning and tactical excellence. But how could anyone defeat an entire civilization that had dedicated itself completely to warfare? Humans had revealed something about their species that would reshape galactic politics forever. They were not just warriors. They were an entire race of beings who would sacrifice anything to protect what they valued. They could not be intimidated because they did not fear death. They could not be discouraged because losses only strengthened their resolve. The journey back to Valorian space gave Zethkar too much time to think about what he had witnessed. His ship's computers processed terabytes of recorded data, while he struggled to find words that could adequately describe the human approach to warfare. Standard military terminology seemed inadequate for phenomena that violated every established principle of civilized combat. His preliminary report outlined facts that would have been dismissed as impossible if they had come from any less reliable source. A technologically inferior species had defeated one of the galaxy's most successful military organizations. They had achieved victory through tactics that treated individual lives as expendable resources. Most disturbing of all, they had demonstrated that entire civilian populations could be transformed into military assets. The High Council would expect analysis and recommendations based on his observations. But how could he explain that humans represented a threat not through superior technology or numbers, but through their absolute refusal to accept defeat? They did not fight to conquer territory or resources. They fought to survive, and a species that fought for survival would never stop fighting. Zethkar reviewed footage of the memorial service where Admiral Thompson had addressed families of the war dead. Her words haunted him because they revealed a fundamental truth about human psychology that made them unlike any other species in recorded galactic history. They were willing to sacrifice everything to protect what they valued, and they valued their independence above their own lives. This created strategic problems that had no known solutions. Military doctrine throughout the galaxy was based on the assumption that rational opponents would eventually recognize superior force and negotiate acceptable surrender terms. Humans appeared to lack whatever psychological mechanisms made other species capable of rational surrender. They would fight until they were completely exterminated, or their enemies abandoned the field. The recordings from Colony 7 showed human civilians fighting alongside professional soldiers in circumstances where any reasonable population would have demanded protection from their own military forces. Instead of blaming their leaders for involving them in hopeless conflicts, These civilians seemed grateful for the opportunity to participate in their own defense. Children had served as scouts and message runners in combat zones. Elderly humans had operated heavy weapons despite obvious physical limitations. Even wounded civilians had continued supporting military operations until they were physically incapable of further service. The entire population had functioned as an integrated military unit rather than a group of individuals seeking personal survival. Zethkar found no precedent for such behavior in the historical records of 43 known civilizations. Some species fought fiercely when defending their home worlds, but they maintained clear distinctions between military and civilian roles. Professional soldiers protected non-combatants who supported them through industrial production and political legitimacy. Combat remained the responsibility of trained specialists, while ordinary citizens pursued peaceful activities. Human society seemed to operate according to completely different principles. The line between soldiers and civilians had disappeared entirely during the crisis. Military objectives took priority over individual safety at every level of their social organization. Even children were expected to contribute to collective defense, rather than being sheltered from dangerous realities. The psychological profiles his computers had constructed from intercepted communications showed disturbing patterns. Individual humans expressed fear and uncertainty about specific tactical situations, but they displayed no doubt whatsoever about the fundamental necessity of fighting. They seemed to consider warfare a natural and inevitable aspect of existence, rather than an unfortunate breakdown of civilized relations. Captain Morrison's final transmission during the space battle exemplified this mindset. He had faced certain death while commanding a fleet that was hopelessly outnumbered, yet his words reflected satisfaction rather than despair. He had been proud to trade his life for temporary tactical advantages that might help other humans escape immediate danger. This attitude appeared throughout human military communications at every rank and position. Individual soldiers spoke casually about dying for their comrades. Unit commanders planned operations that assumed heavy casualties among their own forces. Senior officers allocated resources based on calculations that treated human lives as acceptable costs for achieving strategic objectives. Such thinking should have been limited to desperate circumstances where survival itself was at stake. Instead, it seemed to represent normal human approaches to military planning and decision-making. They had developed institutional mechanisms for processing massive casualties without experiencing the social disruption that would cripple most civilizations. The footage from resistance operations on occupied territories was even more troubling. Human civilians had endured months of enemy occupation, while secretly organizing networks that gathered intelligence and planned coordinated attacks. They had accepted enormous personal risks to provide information that helped professional military units locate and destroy enemy positions. Grandparents had taught their grandchildren how to identify Catherian equipment types and communication protocols. Shopkeepers had mapped enemy patrol routes and supply schedules. Factory workers had sabotaged their own workplaces to deny useful resources to occupying forces. An entire population had transformed itself into an intelligence-gathering organization that operated under conditions where discovery meant certain death. Zethkar struggled to imagine his own people maintaining such discipline and commitment under similar circumstances. Valorian civilians would have cooperated with occupying forces to minimize personal danger, while hoping that professional military units would eventually restore normal conditions. The concept of ordinary citizens risking their families to support guerrilla operations was nearly incomprehensible. The implications of human military capabilities extended far beyond the immediate conflict with the Catherian collective. Any species that encountered humans in warfare would face opponents who could not be intimidated through superior numbers or technology. Traditional military advantages would prove irrelevant against enemies who treated individual survival as less important than collective objectives. Diplomatic solutions would be extremely difficult to achieve because humans seemed incapable of rational surrender, even when facing impossible odds. They would continue fighting long past the point where any reasonable opponent would seek negotiated settlements. Peace. Treaties would only provide them with opportunities to rearm and prepare for renewed hostilities. Most dangerous of all was their apparent ability to inspire similar dedication among allied species. The few non-human civilians who had been present during the fighting had adopted human tactical methods and psychological attitudes. Humans seemed capable of transforming other cultures through example and influence. Zethkar began composing his final report with growing reluctance. The High Council needed accurate information to formulate appropriate policies regarding humanity. But he understood that his observations would influence decisions that might determine the future of galactic civilization. Knowledge of human capabilities would spread regardless of security classifications. The galaxy contained thousands of species with competing interests and conflicting territorial claims. If they learned that humans could not be defeated through conventional military methods, some might seek them as allies, while others would demand preemptive action to eliminate potential threats. Either response could trigger conflicts that would reshape the entire political landscape. In his private quarters, Zethkar wrote the words that would haunt him for the remainder of his long life. The human species represents an existential challenge to established galactic order, not through malice, but through their absolute unwillingness to accept defeat. They do not fight to conquer, but to survive. A species that fights for survival will never stop fighting. He sealed the report and transmitted it to the High Council with maximum security protocols. Within hours, the response came back with classification levels that exceeded his security clearance. The information would be restricted to a handful of senior officials who would decide how to proceed. But Zethkar knew that secrets rarely remained secret when they involved matters of galactic significance. Eventually, other species would encounter humans in military conflicts and learn the same terrible truths he had documented. The galaxy would discover that humanity represented a new kind of threat that could not be contained through traditional methods. He had been commanded to witness humans in battle and expected to document their inevitable defeat. Instead, he had recorded evidence of humanity's terrifying strength and revealed it to leaders who might use that knowledge to justify actions he could not predict or control. The assignment that should have been routine observation had become something that would reshape the balance of power among civilizations. Zethkar completed his duty and began living with regret.